The radar screen went blank at 11:47 p.m., September 14, 1987. One moment, TransGlobal Flight 227 was a steady phosphorescent blip crossing the North Atlantic en route from Montreal to Paris. The next, nothing. Air traffic controller Martin Devereaux stared at the empty screen, his coffee cooling in his hand, waiting for the transponder signal to reappear. It never did. 89 passengers and crew had simply ceased to exist in controlled airspace, leaving behind only radio silence and a widening circle of confusion that would consume the next 6 months of investigation. The Boeing 767 had departed Trudeau International at 9:32 p.m., 43 minutes behind schedule due to a minor hydraulic check. Now it was gone. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy deep, real-world investigations. Captain Raymond Fisk, 52 years old with 19,000 flight hours, had flown this route 73 times. His first officer, Claire Montrose, 31, was less experienced but highly regarded among TransGlobal's pilot corps. The passenger manifest included business travelers heading to European meetings, honeymooners beginning their journey in Paris, a string quartet returning from a North American tour, and 2 unaccompanied minors, siblings aged 9 and 11, traveling to meet their father in France. The flight plan called for a standard Great Circle route across the Atlantic, with estimated landing at Charles de Gaulle at 10:15 a.m. local time. Weather conditions were excellent, clear skies, light winds. No turbulence forecasted along the route. Devereaux replayed the final radio exchange in his mind. Fisk's voice had been calm, routine, confirming altitude and heading. TransGlobal 227, level at flight level 350, maintaining course 092, all systems nominal. Standard phraseology. Nothing in his tone suggested concern. Then, 19 seconds of silence before the screen went dark. No distress call, no indication of mechanical failure, no mayday. Just absence where a commercial airliner carrying 89 souls should be. Within 11 minutes, the shift supervisor had initiated emergency protocols. Adjacent radar sectors were queried through telephone calls and teletype messages. Nothing. Oceanic control centers in Gander, Newfoundland, and Reykjavik, Iceland, reported no contact. Military radar installations were contacted, still nothing. A growing knot of personnel gathered around the radar console, their faces illuminated by the pale green glow, watching empty space where an aircraft should be transmitting. The supervisor placed a call to TransGlobal Operations, then to the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, then to the Canadian Forces Maritime Command. By 12:40 a.m., a CP-140 Aurora Maritime Patrol aircraft lifted off from CFB Greenwood in Nova Scotia, its crew preparing search and rescue equipment for a pattern sweep over the last known coordinates. The coordinates placed Flight 227 approximately 400 nautical miles east-southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland, over deep Atlantic waters where the ocean floor dropped to 14,000 feet. Cold water, strong currents. If the aircraft had gone down there, survival time would be measured in minutes, not hours. Dawn on September 15th brought low clouds and 12-foot swells rolling beneath grey skies. The Aurora crew scanned the surface through binoculars and forward-looking infrared equipment, searching for debris fields, oil slicks, emergency flotation devices, or the bright orange of life rafts. They found nothing. No wreckage, no fuel sheen reflecting morning light, no rafts bobbing in the waves. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, indifferent and concealing. By noon, a U.S. Coast Guard C-130 Hercules had joined the search, along with 2 Canadian Coast Guard vessels redirecting from routine patrols. The search grid expanded hourly, a widening rectangle of diminishing hope. Lead investigator Thomas Ashford arrived at the Canadian Aviation Safety Board headquarters in Ottawa on September 16th, carrying a leather briefcase and 31 years of accident investigation experience. Ashford was 57, grey-haired, with the methodical temperament of a man who understood that answers emerged from evidence, not speculation. He had worked the Arrow air crash in Gander 2 years prior, the charter flight that killed 248 American soldiers returning from peacekeeping duty. He knew how families grieved. He knew how media pressure could distort investigations. He knew the difference between what people wanted to hear and what the evidence actually revealed. His team assembled in a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor. Meteorologist Sandra Vieira spread synoptic weather charts across the table, tracing isobars with her finger. No significant turbulence reported in the sector that night, she said. Winds at cruise altitude were 15 knots from the northwest, visibility unrestricted. No convective activity, no frontal systems, no icing conditions. Meteorologically, it was a quiet night over the North Atlantic. Flight data analyst Paul Chen reviewed the maintenance logs for aircraft registration CFTGM. The Boeing 767 had accumulated 14,200 hours total time since delivery in 1983. It had undergone a routine C-check 6 weeks earlier at TransGlobal's maintenance facility in Montreal. No outstanding mechanical write-ups. No deferred maintenance items. The hydraulic issue that delayed departure had been traced to a pressure sensor, giving erroneous cockpit readings. The actual hydraulic system tested normally. The sensor was replaced, the system rechecked, and the aircraft cleared for service. The engine's 2 Pratt & Whitney PW4000 turbofans had accumulated 12,000 hours since last overhaul, well within operational limits. "What about the transponder?" Ashford asked, studying the radar data printouts. Chen shook his head. Mode C was functioning normally until 11:47:19. Strong return signal, then nothing. No gradual degradation. No intermittent behavior. Just complete loss of signal, as if someone pulled the circuit breaker. Ashford studied the timeline written in chalk on the blackboard. Departure at 9:32 p.m. Climb to cruise altitude. Level off at 35,000 feet. Normal cruise. Final radio contact at 11:46:52. Transponder loss at 11:47:19. 27 seconds between last voice contact and radar loss. How long would it take for an aircraft at that altitude to descend to sea level? Without power, in a controlled glide. Vieira calculated mentally. The 767 has a glide ratio of about 17:1. From 35,000 feet, that's roughly 12 to 14 minutes of glide time before impact, covering maybe 120 nautical miles. With power but uncontrolled, maybe 4 to 6 minutes. If there was an explosive decompression or structural failure, much faster. And we'd expect a wide debris field with an in-flight breakup, Ashford said. Pieces scattered over miles of ocean. Correct, which we're not finding. Chen tapped his pencil against the table. Hijacking scenario? It was 1987. Hijackings were not uncommon. TWA Flight 847 had been seized 2 years earlier, Pan Am 73 just the previous year. But hijackers wanted publicity. They wanted their demands broadcast, their grievances heard. Radio silence served no tactical purpose. And where would they have diverted? Gander was the closest suitable airport. Reykjavik was possible. But both would have detected the aircraft on radar. Shannon in Ireland was within fuel range, but even farther. Every scenario ended with someone detecting something. We need to consider it, Ashford said, but it doesn't fit the pattern. Let's focus on mechanical scenarios first. The search intensified over the following weeks. By September 20th, 9 surface vessels and 4 aircraft were combing a search zone covering 19,000 square nautical miles of Atlantic Ocean. Oceanographic specialists were consulted to predict drift patterns for floating debris based on wind, current, and sea state. The Gulf Stream's northeastward flow would carry surface material toward Iceland and the British Isles, but the calculations required assumptions about when and where the aircraft entered the water, assumptions they didn't have evidence to support. Ashford flew to Montreal on September 22nd to interview ground crew and review departure procedures. The maintenance hangar smelled of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel. Mechanics in coveralls moved between workstations, their voices echoing off aluminum walls. The mechanic who signed off on the hydraulic sensor replacement, Louis Garneau, was a 23-year veteran with a clean record. He walked Ashford through the repair step by step, referencing his handwritten logbook entries. "We followed the maintenance manual exactly," Garneau said, his voice defensive. "Removed the faulty sensor. Installed the new unit. Ran the hydraulic system through 3 complete cycles. Pressures were within specifications. No leaks, no anomalies. It was a straightforward sensor replacement, maybe 40 minutes of work, including paperwork." "Did anyone else access the aircraft after you completed the repair?" Garneau consulted his logbook, flipping back through pages of entries. Catering service loaded galley supplies at 8:50 p.m. Fuel truck finished topping tanks at 9:05. Baggage handlers completed loading at 9:18. Then Captain Fisk did his exterior walk-around inspection before boarding. Captain Fisk did his own walk-around. He always did. Some captains rely on the ground crew, but Fisk liked to check things himself. Professional guy. Careful. Ashford interviewed the catering supervisor, the fuel truck operator, the baggage handlers, the gate agents. Everyone remembered September 14th as routine. The aircraft had sat at gate C-27 under sodium vapor lights, passenger boarding proceeding normally through the jetway. No unusual activity, no unauthorized personnel near the aircraft, no maintenance issues reported. The gate agent, a woman named Michelle Tremblay, recalled the 2 unaccompanied minors being escorted aboard by their grandmother, who stood at the gate window watching until the jetway door closed. "Captain Fisk came out to the gate before boarding," Tremblay said. He introduced himself to the grandmother, assured her the children would be looked after during the flight. He even wrote down his name for her. She seemed relieved. He had that effect on people, very calm, very professional. Ashford felt the familiar weight settling into his chest. Good people doing ordinary things, their lives intersecting for a few hours before vanishing into mystery. He returned to Ottawa and convened his team to work through failure scenarios systematically. "Explosive decompression," Chen suggested. "Possible," Vieira responded, "but we'd expect rapid descent and debris. The aircraft would break apart under aerodynamic stress. We'd see wreckage by now. Catastrophic engine failure." "The 767 is certified for ETOPS, extended twin-engine operations," Chen said. "It can fly on one engine. Even a double-engine failure would give the crew time to transmit a mayday and attempt a ditching. We'd have heard something." "Electrical fire." Vieira looked skeptical. "An electrical fire severe enough to incapacitate all communication systems and navigation equipment simultaneously. That's extremely fast. Too fast for the crew to react?" "What about controlled flight into terrain?" someone suggested. "At 35,000 feet over open ocean." Ashford shook his head. "There's no terrain, and the radar altimeter would have alerted them long before sea level." They worked until after midnight, constructing and deconstructing theories, each scenario collapsing under logical scrutiny. The fundamental problem was absence of evidence. Without wreckage, without flight recorder data, without eyewitness accounts, they were building hypotheses on vacuum. On September 27th, everything changed. A Norwegian fishing trawler operating 400 miles south of Iceland radioed Canadian Coast Guard to report recovering a piece of aircraft debris. Blue fabric seat cushion, waterlogged, logo visible, TransGlobal Airlines. The item was photographed with a Polaroid camera, coordinates logged in the ship's log, and the cushion secured in plastic sheeting for transport to Reykjavik. Ashford flew to Iceland the next morning. The cushion lay on a stainless steel examination table in a harbourmaster's warehouse near the port. Ashford circled it slowly, studying the tears in the fabric, the compression patterns in the foam, the absence of burn marks or chemical staining. He pulled on latex gloves and examined the edges where the fabric had torn away from its metal frame. No charring, he observed to the Icelandic Civil Aviation Liaison Officer. No fire damage, no chemical residue visible to the naked eye. A textile analyst from Reykjavik University took fabric samples with scissors and tweezers, sealing them in evidence bags. The material appears to have been immersed in seawater for at least 10 days, possibly longer. The degradation pattern is consistent with prolonged exposure to salt water, ultraviolet radiation, and mechanical action from waves. We'll run more detailed tests, but preliminary assessment suggests this detached from the aircraft post-impact rather than during flight. Any biological material, blood, tissue. We're testing, but visual inspection shows none. Ashford pulled out navigation charts and calculated drift patterns. If the cushion entered the water near Flight 227's last known position on September 14th, prevailing currents and winds could have carried it northeast toward Iceland over 13 days. The mathematics were plausible. He authorized expanded search operations along the projected drift corridor. Over the next 3 weeks, 6 additional items were recovered by fishing vessels and merchant ships transiting the area. A meal service tray with TransGlobal branding, a section of overhead storage bin, the plastic cracked and salt-encrusted, a child sneaker, size 2, blue with white laces, a paperback book, pages swollen and illegible, a seat armrest, a plastic cup. Each item was photographed, catalogued, and shipped to Ottawa for analysis. Forensic specialists mapped the recovery locations, attempting to backtrack the debris field to a point of origin. But no bodies. No fuselage sections, no landing gear, no engines, no flight recorders. The ocean had swallowed the substantial components, leaving only lightweight fragments that floated. Would you have made the same call if you'd been in their place, committing millions of dollars in search resources based on a handful of floating debris with no bodies, no wreckage, no definitive proof? By late October, Ashford's team had interviewed 147 people connected to Flight 227, airline personnel, family members of passengers and crew, air traffic controllers, weather observers, military radar operators in Canada, Greenland, and Iceland. They reviewed maintenance records extending back 2 years, scrutinized Captain Fisk's training files and check ride evaluations, examined First Officer Montrose's psychological assessments and performance reviews. Nothing indicated suicidal ideation, no financial problems, no personal crises, no security threats, just professional aviators doing their jobs. Chen approached Ashford in the headquarters cafeteria on October 29th, carrying a folder of computer printouts. I've been analyzing the radar data from Gander using frame-by-frame enhancement. I borrowed image processing equipment from the Defense Research Establishment. We've already been through the radar tapes. Not like this. Look at these 3 frames. He spread printouts across the cafeteria table. Each showed a magnified and computer-enhanced section of the radar, returned from Flight 227's final moments. This frame is 11:46:52, last voice contact. Clear return, strong signal. This frame is 11:47:09, signal still present but beginning to weaken. And this frame is 11:47:19. The signal is almost gone, just a faint echo. Ashford leaned closer, studying the progression. The transponder didn't just shut off instantly, it faded over several radar sweeps, exactly, which suggests the aircraft was either descending below the radar horizon or something was interfering with signal propagation, or the transponder power was failing gradually. What kind of interference? That's what I can't explain. Atmospheric ducting can cause anomalies, but Vera says conditions weren't right for that. Ionospheric disturbance is possible, but rare at those frequencies. Or something aboard the aircraft was degrading the electrical system progressively. Ashford took the printouts back to his office and pinned them to the corkboard above his desk. He stared at them for hours. The gradual signal fade, contradicting the sudden catastrophe scenarios they'd been exploring. A progressive electrical failure made more sense, but what would cause that? He requested copies of all air traffic control communications in the North Atlantic region for the night of September 14th. It took 2 weeks to compile transcripts from Gander, Reykjavik, Shannon and Santa Maria, pages and pages of routine radio calls, altitude changes, weather reports, position reports, nothing anomalous, until page 47. British Airways Flight 113, a Boeing 747 en route from New York to London, had filed a pilot report at 11:51 p.m. The notation read, "Observed brief visual anomaly bearing 190 degrees, estimated distance 150 to 200 miles, appeared as bright white-blue flash lasting approximately 2 seconds, no associated radio transmission, no explanation apparent, possibly distant lightning, although no convective activity reported in sector." Ashford sat up straighter. A bright flash. 4 minutes after Flight 227's transponder went silent, roughly 200 miles from the last known position, he pulled out navigation charts and plotted BA 113's position at 11:51 p.m., then drew sightlines toward Flight 227's last coordinates. The geometry aligned. If something luminous had occurred at Flight 227's location around 11:47 to 11:49, a crew member on BA 113 could have seen it from 200 miles away. He placed a transatlantic call to British Airways operations in London, requesting contact information for the crew of BA 113 from September 14, 1987. After 3 days of bureaucratic navigation, he reached Captain Edmund Hargrove, now retired and living in Surrey. The telephone conversation was brief and precise. Hargrove remembered the incident clearly. "My first officer spotted it first. He was looking out the left side window during cruise. Said he saw a bright flash, very intense, white with bluish tint, lasting perhaps 2 seconds. I looked, but it was already over. We were at 37,000 feet, heading eastbound. The flash appeared to be below our altitude, distant, toward the south-southwest. We discussed whether to report it, decided we should, filed it with Gander, never heard anything back, assumed it was some atmospheric phenomenon." "Did it look like lightning?" "Neither of us thought so. Lightning has a characteristic branching structure. This was more of a point source flash, almost like a photographic strobe, but much larger scale. If I had to guess, I'd say it looked like an electrical arc." Ashford thanked him and disconnected. An electrical arc visible from 200 miles away. That would require enormous voltage and current. A catastrophic short circuit in the aircraft's main electrical distribution system could theoretically produce such an arc, especially if it involved the primary power bus contacting the airframe structure. But the Boeing 767's electrical systems were designed with multiple redundancies, specifically to prevent total electrical failure. He convened the team again. Hypothesis: massive electrical system failure, not a fire, not an explosion. An electrical fault that cascades through the distribution system, knocking out all power simultaneously. Chen looked skeptical. The 767 has backup systems, standby instruments, battery power. Even if you lose main generators, There are layers of redundancy. What if the failure occurred at the distribution center itself, before the redundancies branch off? That's a single point of failure, Vieira said slowly. And yes, it's theoretically possible. But it would require a catastrophic short circuit in the main bus that would arc like hell. Lots of light, lots of heat. Enough light to see from 200 miles away? Possibly. If it vented outside the aircraft structure, yes. And then what happens? Chen walked to the chalkboard and began drawing diagrams. Total electrical failure means you lose flight instruments, navigation, communication, autopilot, transponder, cockpit lighting, everything. The engines would keep running, they're mechanically controlled, but without instruments, at night over water, the pilots are essentially blind. They'd have airspeed by feel, attitude by seat of the pants, but no altitude awareness, no heading reference, no way to know if they're climbing, descending, or turning. How long could they maintain controlled flight? Minutes. Maybe 10 or 15 if they're very good and very lucky. But eventually, without visual or instrument reference, spatial disorientation sets in. They'd lose control. Ashford felt pieces beginning to align. So they descend in darkness, trying to maintain wings-level flight by instinct and feel. Eventually they lose orientation and impact the water at high speed and steep angle. Which would explain the lack of widespread debris, Vieira added. A steep angle high-speed impact compresses the fuselage structure. Most of the aircraft would sink rapidly, only lightweight components would float free. The scenario fit, but what caused the electrical failure? They spent the next 6 weeks systematically examining every aspect of the Boeing 767's electrical system design. Wiring diagrams, circuit breaker panels, generator specifications, distribution bus architecture. Chen built a 3-dimensional schematic on butcher paper that covered an entire conference room wall. The main electrical distribution center was located in an equipment bay above and behind the cockpit, accessible through a ceiling panel. It consisted of a complex junction box where power from the main generators, auxiliary power unit, and battery systems converged before being distributed to various aircraft systems. It was supposed to be one of the most reliable components on the aircraft. "I want to inspect an actual distribution center," Ashford said. "Not diagrams, the real thing." TransGlobal Airlines cooperated fully, providing access to an identical Boeing 767, registration CFTGN, sister ship to the missing aircraft. On December 8th, Ashford and 2 electrical engineers, Diane Koss and Robert Chen, crawled into the cramped equipment bay above the cockpit of the parked aircraft in TransGlobal's Montreal maintenance hangar. The space was tight, lit by work lights clipped to structural members. The distribution center was a rectangular metal box, approximately 18 inches by 24 inches, mounted to the airframe with bolts. Bundles of color-coded wires entered and exited through conduits, each bundle secured with metal clamps, according to engineering specifications. Diane Koss, a specialist in aircraft electrical systems, began photographing the installation from multiple angles, comparing the actual configuration to engineering diagrams spread on the floor below. After 40 minutes of careful examination, she pointed to a wire bundle near the bottom of the distribution box. "This routing is non-standard." Ashford squeezed closer. "What do you mean?" "According to the engineering diagram, this bundle, these are the main generator feeds, should route through this channel here, secured with metal clamps at intervals of no more than 6 inches. But this bundle has been rerouted around this structural support, secured with plastic zip ties instead of metal clamps, and it passes within 2 inches of this hydraulic line. Is that a problem? Potentially. Hydraulic lines carry fluid under high pressure and generate significant heat. If this wire bundle is chronically exposed to heat, the insulation can degrade over time. The wires are rated for 200 degrees Celsius, but chronic exposure to 150 degrees will cause the insulation to become brittle. Once it's brittle, vibration can crack it. Once it's cracked, you get bare wire exposed. If bare wire contacts the aluminum airframe structure, you get a massive short circuit directly on the main power bus. Ashford felt his pulse accelerate. How long would this degradation take? Depends on the heat exposure and vibration environment. Could be months. Could be years. But if this rerouting happened during maintenance and the aircraft was then flown for weeks or months with the wires slowly cooking, yes, eventually you'd get insulation failure. They carefully removed a section of the rerouted wire bundle and sent it to the National Research Council laboratory in Ottawa for microscopic analysis. The results came back 8 days later. The insulation showed thermal stress patterns consistent with prolonged exposure to elevated temperatures. Microcracking was visible at 200x magnification. The insulation hadn't failed completely on this particular aircraft, but it was compromised. Ashford returned to Montreal with the laboratory report and re-interviewed the entire maintenance crew that had worked on CFTGM during its C-check in early August. After hours of careful, non-accusatory questioning, a mechanic named Robert Thibault broke. "I rerouted that bundle," he admitted, his hands shaking. "There was a relay behind the distribution box that was giving us trouble. Intermittent fault. To access it, I had to temporarily move the wire bundle out of the way. I secured it with zip ties, planning to put it back once we fixed the relay, but we got busy. The shift ended. I logged the relay repair, but I forgot about the wire bundle. I assumed someone else would notice during the inspection. I didn't mean..." His voice broke. Ashford waited. "I killed them," Thibault whispered. 89 people, because I forgot to move some wires back." "You didn't kill anyone," Ashford said quietly. "A chain of failures killed them. Maintenance procedures that allowed temporary modifications to become permanent. Inspection protocols that didn't catch the discrepancy. A system that relied too heavily on individual memory instead of checklists. You made a mistake. The system should have caught it." But Ashford knew the truth was more complicated. One small oversight, a rerouted wire bundle, multiplied by thermal stress over 6 weeks and 73 flights, had degraded insulation until bare copper wire contacted aluminum structure at 35,000 feet over the North Atlantic on September 14, 1987. The resulting arc would have been instantaneous and catastrophic, a massive electrical short that cascaded through the distribution center, severing power to every system simultaneously. Captain Fisk and First Officer Montrose would have had perhaps 5 seconds of illumination as backup battery lights activated before those failed too. Then complete darkness, no instruments, no radio, no way to know altitude, heading, or attitude. Just the sound of engines and the feel of control yoke. They would have tried. Fisk had 19,000 hours of experience. He would have attempted to maintain wings-level flight by vestibular sense and engine sound. But at night, over featureless ocean, without any external visual reference, spatial disorientation is inevitable. The human vestibular system cannot reliably sense orientation without visual input. Within minutes, perhaps less, they would have entered an uncontrolled descent. The impact would have been violent, high speed, steep angle. The fuselage would have crumpled like aluminum foil. The aircraft would have sunk within minutes, carried down by the weight of engines and structure into 14,000 feet of Atlantic darkness. The final report was submitted to Transport Canada and the International Civil Aviation Organization on March 15, 1988. It documented the electrical failure mechanism in technical detail and included 17 safety recommendations. All Boeing 767 operators were directed to conduct immediate inspections of main electrical distribution center wiring. Maintenance procedures were revised to require photographic documentation before and after any wire bundle modification. Inspection checklists were updated to specifically verify wire routing against engineering diagrams. Training programs for maintenance personnel were enhanced to emphasize the cascade failure risks of electrical system modifications. The families of Flight 227's 89 passengers and crew held a memorial service on the coast of Newfoundland on June 18, 1988. Ashford attended, standing at the back of the gathering, watching as parents and spouses and children walked to the edge of the rocks and laid flowers into the waves. The flowers drifted on the current, white and yellow blossoms floating on grey-green water, moving slowly northeast toward the distant place where their loved ones had entered the ocean 8 months earlier. Captain Fisk's wife, Margaret, approached Ashford as the crowd dispersed. She was a small woman in her early 50s, grey streaking through brown hair, eyes red from crying, but voice steady. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding the answer." "I'm sorry we couldn't bring them home," Ashford replied. "You gave us the truth. That's what Ray would have wanted. He was always about the truth, about understanding what happened so it wouldn't happen again. You did that. That's bringing him home in the way that matters." Ashford nodded, unable to speak. He watched her rejoin her grown children at the rocks, watched them hold each other as wind whipped spray against the shore. The wreckage of TransGlobal Flight 227 rests still on the Atlantic floor, 14,000 feet down, beyond the reach of 1980s salvage technology. The black boxes, if they survived the impact, sit silent in eternal darkness, their batteries exhausted within days, their data unrecoverable. The 89 people, business people and musicians and honeymooners and 2 children who held hands walking down the jetway, became part of the ocean, their bodies claimed by the deep in ways that families could never fully comprehend but learned, slowly, to accept. What would you have done differently if you'd been the investigator trying to explain the inexplicable, searching for truth in the absence of evidence, fighting to prevent the same cascade of failures from claiming more lives? If you appreciate real investigations like this one, subscribe and stay curious.